have you been? You been all right?
Not too bad. I've had COVID,
Oh, mate.
so I was a bit rough for a couple of weeks, but no, generally not too bad. I've just been working on a TV series called Bali 2002 about the Bali bombing, and that was pretty good. And I'm about to go to Kashmir in about 2 weeks' time, which is pretty
Isn't it
exciting.
great to be able to travel again? Because I know you
Oh
were
yeah,
always traveling for the job,
yeah,
and
yeah.
and
No, I missed that.
and you would have missed it a lot.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I'm still eating. I'm
No,
starving.
that's okay. That's okay.
It's a really bad lasagna.
And I noticed you actually went out and you were doing a bit of photography for the APRA Awards, a couple of weeks
I
ago.
did, yeah.
And it's good to see you back there doing that because it's been a while.
Do you know, I worked it. I'm probably the longest serving APRA person. I've been doing it for 24 years.
Wow.
Um, I'm not quite sure why. Um, and I love the APRA Awards. Um, I'm not into slagging the ARIA Awards, but the ARIA Awards are very, I don't know what the word is, wanky, and very, people have agendas, whereas the APRA Awards is more about songwriting and music, and it's quite joyous, and it's a good room.
It
It's
is,
always
and I went to my first one last year, and I realised that it was just a genuine old school award show where it was the respected artists that we know and love, and it was almost like the old ARIA Hall of Fame, which was kind of the way it should have been, whereas the ARIAs kind of became a lot of just went too far with the TV being the focus, not the actual artists themselves. So yeah,
the Arias went down a very strange track, and that one they did at the Opera House was getting to where it became Channel 10 personalities became more important than musicians.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
there's some model who didn't even know who Casey Chambers was, and it seemed really weird that you've got presenters who are Channel 10 personalities. There's nothing wrong with not knowing who Casey Chambers is,
Yeah.
but you're at the music awards. Uh,
You know what's funny? That night, it was probably one of the better ones to go to, but on TV it was terrible. Whereas, all the other ones are definitely, better on TV, a bit stale
yeah,
when you're there. But the Opera House one was kind of fun. It just
yeah,
looked bad. It was just awful.
yeah. It was, yeah. I think that was the low. They got to their low point at that point. Um, To be fair, I haven't been to the ARIA Awards for so long now. I shouldn't really comment because I've no idea what it's like. But the APRA Awards are APRA do have good years and bad years, um, because the five songs of the year they usually get other artists to perform them, and they often go wacky, so that they'll get a heavy metal band will do a Paul Kelly song, things like that, and when it works, it's great. And sometimes it can be a bit
Well,
iffy.
my all
But
all time favorite was Jimmy Barnes doing Sia,
yeah,
which
yeah,
was like
it's
5 or 6 years ago. But his voice just nailed it,
yeah,
and
yeah.
sometimes it just works.
Sometimes it just works. Yeah, no, it's great. So yeah, yeah,
So
it's
let's
good.
go back to the beginning of Tony Mott now. So before you were doing professional photography, you were a chef. Is that right?
That's right, a French chef.
And where
I
was
was
that? Was that in Sydney or was that back
in
overseas?
Sydney. Yeah, no, I was in Sydney. I worked at the Opera House for a while. I worked at the Gazebo Hotel in King's Cross and various restaurants. Um, and I was lucky, particularly as a rock and roll photographer, because this is the '80s, and Sydney was, or Australia in general, was the best live music scene in the world. And I was sort of qualified to say that because I was from England and I'd been to America. England was going through a really bad patch live music wise, and Australia, every single pub had bands in it. The Cure toured Sydney in 1981, and they played Sydney for 3 months, and they never played the same suburb twice.
Wow, that's
And that's how
brilliant.
great it was. It was just, and I remember I did some work with the Cure, and I remember did a photo session. We're just talking, and Robert Smith was a little bit demoralised in so much as, oh, we've come on a pub tour, and of course he's English, so he's going pub tour, and he's expecting, to play in the little corner of some little bar because he's English. And their first gig was Selena's, 1,600 people sold out. And at that particular time, it was the biggest gig they'd ever done. And he went, "Who the fuck calls these pubs?" It's like these massive, and of course, the comb and cutter. I mean, Sydney's geographical pubs were just amazing. You could just go, and you got to. I know, although there's nothing wrong with what happened because they brought in random breath testing just after that. But prior to that, people used to just go, would think nothing of going on the other side of Sydney to go and see a band. There was the Royal Antler at Narrabeen, and there was the Sylvania Hotel, Caringbah, and the Comb and Cutter at Blacktown, the Family Inn in Rydalmere. So miles apart, and they all held somewhere between 800 and 1,500 people, a good gig, and they were great gigs. I saw Deep Purple at the Comb and Cutter at Blacktown.
And I remember hearing about Iron Maiden playing, I think it was the Capitol Theatre when they first came to Sydney as well. I mean, I couldn't imagine Iron Maiden performing one of the theatres, you know.
Yeah, no, no. So that's what in that time in the early '80s, the big gig was the Hordern Pavilion. There
Yeah.
wasn't anything bigger. That was the height, and everyone used to complain when bands played the Hordern, saying, "Oh, it's just so cavernous and so huge. It's got no soul, the whole bit." Now, whereas now, and of course, when you go out to and you got to remember, no such thing as stadiums. There was no
Mm.
stadium concerts; they just didn't exist. I think in the I think David Bowie and Fleetwood Mac played the Sydney Showgrounds as one-offs, but stadium tours just didn't exist. And the entertainment centre didn't exist. The entertainment centre I think was built in the mid '80s, and that became the 12,000 seater, and that was just massive. And so the Hordern Pavilion became that was the biggest gig there was.
And you're right. I mean, I remember sort of Fleetwood Mac and ABBA as well was another one.
Yeah.
David Bowie, they played that the showgrounds, and that was it. You're totally right. I think Led Zeppelin did it as well, but they were all, you're right, one-off
Led Zeppelin
shows.
played the Ramwick
Oh,
Racecourse.
it's Randwick. Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
the Ramwick Racecourse, and the stage. If you look at the photos, Philip Morris, who's a great Australian legend of a photographer, he worked with them, and you look at the stage, and it's just like a bit of scaffolding.
Yeah, there
It's
was
just
nothing
nothing.
to it. Yeah, you're
No,
right.
nothing to it, and they played in daytime. It's like Led Zeppelin during the day. That's sort of weird in itself. And the support bands were bands like Free and I can't remember who the other support bands, but it was a hell of a bill. Hell of a bill. I
So
wish I'd have been there.
tell me about your first photo you sold.
Well, as I said, I was a chef, and
Yeah.
so I used to finish work at 9 at 10 o'clock, and 7 nights a week you could then go after work and go and see bands, and I did. And in those days, a thing in the '80s that was quite popular was residencies. So bands would play every Tuesday night for 3 months. I remember Mental as Anything playing at the pub in Paddington, which is Unicorn in Paddington,
Yeah. Yeah.
Midnight Oil at the Civic, and the Divinals used to play the Piccadilly Hotel every Tuesday night. And I used to go down there and watch them and watch Chrissy performing. And I was an amateur photographer, and I was thinking, God, that's got to be difficult to capture that. So I started taking my camera down and photographing every Tuesday night. And finally, their manager, Vince Lovegrove, sort of said, asked to look at the photos. I was so embarrassed, I ignored him and I didn't show him the photos. And then he'd see me every Tuesday night. And eventually, after hassling me, I took him some contact sheets and he bought one and it became a poster. And he paid me $25 and a bottle of vodka.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
I was
So Chrissy Amphlett, you saw her at her absolute rawness and the
Yeah,
prime of
absolutely.
one of the great female artists, and you've gone
At the
from
time,
there.
at the time, she was just a female artist, as in the Diviners. I loved them. I thought they were great. Now I look back over 40 years later, I look back on it. She's the greatest female performer I've ever seen. And by a proverbial mile, no one touches her. She really was that good. And we're not talking Australia, we're talking world class performer. She was. So I got lucky that that's who I basically sort of self taught rock and roll photography, and my subject was Chrissy Ampler. I got unbelievably lucky.
You did, and it's that whole era as well. You were doing film. I mean, the thing is about film, I could imagine it's not cheap, so it would have been expensive.
Yeah,
You couldn't
yeah.
you couldn't machine gun like you can now with digital. So you would have had to been very selective.
Yeah, it's a completely different process. Of course, there's a yin and yang to everything. But so you take a photograph, you're not sure you've got it on film. You then go home, you process your film, you hang it up in chemicals, you dry it, then you get an enlarger, and then that unbelievably thrilling experience of a tray of chemicals and a plain white sheet of paper, and in the with a red light on, and slowly but surely, as you're agitating the chemicals, this image comes up. You're still not sure if you're in focus or not because you can't see in the dark, but you go, oh wow! And then of course there's the oh god, it's not quite sharp. But then there's also the thrill of wow, bloody hell, that's fantastic. And the return on those concerts was if you shot 100 frames, if you got 10 great ones, that's a bloody good night. Or 10 acceptable ones on a good night. And of the 10 acceptable ones, if there's one great or two greats in there, that's a great night. So now the clock goes forward to 2007, and I was dragged into the digital age, kicking and screaming. I just kept film. And I was on the road with Rihanna, and Nikon gave me a digital camera and said, "No, you've got to try it." And I said, I don't want to. But they gave it to me, and I thought, well, I was on the road with her, so I was doing lots of concerts, and I'd already nailed what she needed. So everything we were getting then was bonus. I thought, well, I'll try it out, this digital camera, and I was blown away. That first night, I was so thrilled. The digital was so easy, and as you said, film costs just disappear.
Yeah,
You can
yeah.
you can click and just do whatever you like. You can bracket, you can do whatever you like. And when I looked, when I got back, I went, "Oh my god!" And of course, I was really thrilled. Around the same time, within months of that, I shot Judas Priest and Kiss, and I remember shooting Kiss, and it was just so easy with this digital camera. But I also got a sense of cheating. It's like
Yes, yeah.
it's sort of like a sense of that's too easy. And as I looked down the pit, and there's all these photographers with their, I was just thinking it's all easy for them as well. And all of a sudden, the art of rock and roll photography got this not this it just got diluted slightly. It was much easier in the days of film. There was a huge skill set involved of understanding. Remember, you've got no idea about the lighting, so you're judging your exposure, whereas digital, you just look on the back of the camera, oh fuck that up, and you just change the setting. So you're constantly correcting yourself, and it's dead easy, which is fantastic. I don't want to sound like I'm knocking digital. It's fantastic. But in the days of film, one of my most famous photographs is Johnny Rotten with a halo, and it's got this halo, and he had a fluoro light round his head, and it gave off so much light. It was so difficult to work out the exposure, and everyone knows that photograph and thinks I'm some sort of genius because it looks brilliant.
And I've
What they
seen it. It's
don't know,
amazing. Yes.
what people don't know is that was the fifth attempt because I fucked up the first time, and I was so god, this looks such a great image. I got to get it right, and I couldn't get the exposure right because it was giving off so much light. But I also wanted the light on his face, and finally, it was literally, I remember exactly when it was. It was Christmas Eve, at Christmas Eve down in Cronulla, and I went down and I got the exposure right. But it took me 3 attempts, I think, to get it. And not to mention the other thing in those days, of course, was there's no such thing as a pit. So you were in the crowd pogoing with the punks whilst trying to photograph Johnny Rotten. So it wasn't easy. So of course the thrill was huge. But as I said, the skill set of that was quite huge. You had to know what you were doing. Whereas now digital, I think I could shoot drunk as a skunk and I'd get results now. Whereas I tried that once on film, and I remember coming out of a David Bowie concert thinking I was a genius and I got loads of shots. Everything was out of focus, a bit blurry, not very well exposed. And I realised then maybe the drinking has to be after the concert.
Yeah, yeah, and I noticed, by the way, after 2 years of COVID, I somehow had lost the steady hand, and that's a sort of a thing as well. Like when you're out of
Yeah,
practice, I really had to get sort of back in practice, and the steady hand, the focus was really difficult. I don't know what it was, but you just got to keep doing the muscle memory, and it's funny how you start to actually predict where the band are going to be standing. You sort of you do when you know a band well, you know where they're going
yeah,
to be.
when you often at some point in the early 2000s when bands hired me for live concerts, I used to suggest to them that the first night I won't charge you, and I will shoot it, but I'm not shooting it professionally because you're learning the tricks of what's going on the stage, and then you can have a word with the tour manager and say, well, you know, that fourth song when all this thing goes on there, it would be a really great angle if I was over in point A, point B, and you just learn things. I mean, my biggest thing was touring with the Rolling Stones, which I've done on 2 occasions and once with Mick Jagger solo. you learn their mannerisms, you learn their movements, and you know, by the time you're on the third night, you've worked out this is his mannerism and this is what he does, and in particular songs. "Gimme Shelter" for the Rolling Stones is great for Keith, because when he gets into the solo, he's really getting into it, and he grimaces, and he's bent over, and he's twisted, and he just looks great. And he did it every night, and I just knew exactly where to be to get that shot. And Mick was the same. Mick, you sort of knew, his strutting. There was certain mannerisms when he's strutting you knew how to capture. He's a big pointer. Likes
Now,
to point.
staying on the Stones, tell me the story about when you were doing a portrait of Mick, and this is probably back at the hotel after the show or whatever, and he got a phone call from his mum.
He did.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, he did. Was that 95? I think that was 95. In 95, when he came, he hired a genealogist to look up his family, because a lot of people don't know that Mick's family is Mick's mom was a fourth generation Australian, which at the time was the most you could be for an immigrant. And she left Sydney in 1939 and went to London and met Mick's dad. And she lived on the Parramatta Road at Petersham. So anyway, he hired a genealogist. So he was doing lots of, and he met a load of. He had a luncheon where he met loads of family members. They're the Wollstonecrafts, and it's got nothing to do with the suburb. And loads came, and he met them all. Anyway, at some point, as a consequence of this Australian theme, he had a dry as a bone, and we set up sort of like a studio in a hotel room down at the Rocks. And the only people who were there was the makeup girl, myself, and Tony King, who was Mick Jagger's personal manager. Anyway, we're doing a shoot, and it was a very simple shoot. It wasn't very difficult. And we'd only been going for about, I don't know, 5 minutes, when all of a sudden Tony King says to me, "Oh, there's a phone call." And Mick immediately says, he goes, "Oh, no, you got to take it." And he takes it. And he sort of backs off to me. And all I hear from Mick, and you've got to remember, this is Mick Jagger that's in front of me, is go, "Yeah, yeah, no, I have done it. I have done it. I have. It's organised. It's going to happen." "No, no, no." And he's obviously getting told off. I'm thinking, bloody hell, it's Mick. And I turned to Tony King and I said, "Who the hell's telling Mick Jagger?" "Oh, it's his mum. He's organising this luncheon for the family. She's just making sure he's done it." So there was, it sort of just made Mick, not that I ever thought Mick Jagger wasn't a human, but all of a sudden you realise he's Mick Jagger, but he can't get away with anything with his mum, as we all can't.
As we all can't. And from that, you've done some massive, gigs, and some which you didn't realize were going to be so important historically, and that was Queen's final gig at Nebworth. And I remember you saying that you were there from the beginning right to the end. So you were there for the sound check, and you saw Freddie at work to make sure
Yeah,
it was
yeah,
right.
yeah. So the sound check was, he had a roadie. I mean, Nebworth is 240,000 people, so we're talking massive. And he got a roadie to go with a flag to the bottom of the top of the hill, to the furthest point where the audience. And he said, all our light show, video, everything, and me is focused on that, because if we're entertaining that git, these guys are easy. And he had loads of vaudeville tricks. He used to split, if the crowd wasn't happening, he'd split the crowd. He'd go, "Everybody on the right go, yay!" Oh, everybody on the left go, yay! Oh, and they get it, all the boys, yay! All the girls. So he'd split there. He did about 6 songs in the middle of it, he'd be strutting away, and he'd wave at someone in the crowd as if he knew them. And because everyone's going, "Oh my God, he knows one of us." It's just his little trick. So he was an amazing performer. He literally had the whole crowd completely uh, in the palm of his hand. He just, of all the artists I've ever shot, he's the greatest frontman without a doubt. He just. I mean, the fact that Queen's songs were anthemic helped. They were made for the big stadiums, but my God, he could work an audience. Remembering that the band weren't very charismatic, great players, and they just did their thing. They left it all to him, and my God, they didn't have to worry about it. He just, yeah, phenomenal performer. What I didn't know at the time was, so this is Nebworth, and they did 2 nights there, so they played to 500,000 people on the weekend. And at the time, it wasn't like it wasn't advertised as the last gig. It just was the last gig, and they never ever played again. I've asked a few people. I still know their tour manager, who knew at that point whether, or even if, and no one's ever been able to answer me. And it's not in the documentary about whether he knew he was ill at that point. and whether they knew this would be the last gig. But it wasn't advertised that way at all. It was the end of a tour, and they did 2 nights at Nebworth, and they never played again. So I shot Queen's last ever concert. They gave me a helicopter for the day, which and at the time I'd never been in a helicopter. And I remember being backstage, and over the tannoy, they said, "Could Tony Mott come to the publicity tent?" And I went there, and they said, "Oh, your pilot's getting a bit. You haven't been up yet." And I went, thinking, "Do I have to pay? I mean, anyway, I went in, and anyway, the pilot said, he goes, "Are you the Aussie guy?" And I said, "Yeah." And he's going, "Oh, thank God, yeah." He goes, "God, I've had some wankers in this bloody helicopter. Some of them don't even know to shoot 125th of a second." I went, "Really?" Because I didn't know
Yeah,
either. There's this camera shake in
of
a
course.
helicopter that you're not aware of, and I wouldn't have known, so I would have probably shot it too low. So he put me up in the helicopter, and when you went up in the helicopter and saw the audience, you just went. You then know what 240,000 people is. Um, uh, Not that I'm criticising anybody, but whenever they go on about crowded house at the Opera House, and the figures go up and up, there's no way there's 100,000 people on the. You just can't fit 100,000 people in that space.
No.
I've seen 240,000 people in a field. There's no way that that crowd. If there was 50,000 people, that's a hell of a lot on the Opera House steps. Yeah. So I always, every time they come up with the Opera House and they go, yeah, I hear figures all the time. It's like, but when you see 240,000 people, you go, bloody hell!
Well, it
It was
creates
like
its own weather system as well. There's so many people,
oh,
it's
well,
horrible.
there was a time delay when Queen did Radio Gaga, and they did Radio Gaga, and they're doing that. When you're on stage shooting it, the back is slightly out of time to the front because the delay is that far. There's a
Wow.
delay in it. It looks, and there's no way you wouldn't get goosebumps from seeing them when they he had everyone in the field doing Radio Gaga.
Now
Um,
tell us about the after party. That was another big story.
the after party, yes.
Yeah.
Uh, so I was very new to the industry. I wasn't to this day. I'm not quite sure how I got the gig, but I knew a girl at EMI in London, and I got hired to shoot it. And then at some point during it, she said, "Oh, do you want to come to the party afterwards?" And of course, I did. And she said, "There's no way you can bring your cameras. Here's a ticket. Is it the Kensington Gardens Hotel, really posh hotel. I dump all my gear at the hotel, and I go to the hotel where the party is. You went in the lift, and the lift you were greeted by 2 models, one male, one female, stark naked, serving you champagne. So you're in a lift with a champagne with 2 naked. It's like I could have happily gone up and down the lift all night. So you get up into the ballroom, and when you enter the ballroom, I think I was drinking Sauvignon Blanc in those days. And I remember going to the bar and saying Sauvignon Blanc, and they just gave you a bottle of 1950s French Sauvignon Blanc. The guy next to me ordered a vodka and tomato juice, bottle of Stolly, pitcher of tomato juice. There's no messing with all that. Um, the other thing about their room was I didn't know anybody. I needed one friend so I could just nudge and go, "Can you believe what's going on?" Every second person in the room was famous. You'd see the girl who reads the news, Annie Lennox, David Bowie, Page 3 girls, models. Everyone was famous in the room, and you were wondering now. As the party progressed, it got more and more debauched. It's the first time I've seen 2 women basically having sex in public. It was going off completely, and in the middle of it, there was dwarfs wandering around. Uh, what I thought were handing out canopies, and they had plates on their head, and they were basically having lines on the plates. There was no one going to the toilet; everyone was just leaning over, and it was purely debauch. But the most bizarre thing of the whole thing was, so you're watching this room, dwarfs wandering around with drugs on their plates. There's people going off. There's Freddie holding court on stage. Every second person. The newsreaders there. The soap stars, the whole bit. And when you went to the end of the ballroom, you went up some rise up steps, and so you could look out on this debauched rock and roll party. But in the next room, smaller room, was Queen's family and children having what could only be described as an English afternoon tea party, drinking tea. And I know that one of Freddie's, I can't remember whether it was his mom or auntie, and said, "Wasn't Freddie wonderful on stage this afternoon?" And there's nannies with all the kids. So as you stood there, you looked one way, and it was just pure debauchery, like, oh my God. And you look that way, English tea party. It was very, very bizarre. That was my first ever huge rock and roll party. As I said, I was new to the industry. I thought, my God, welcome to rock and roll. I've never been to anything that even came remotely close to that. It was Q Magazine in London did a thing on the 10 greatest rock and roll parties, and it made it. So I felt that was quite good. I've been to one of the top 10 parties ever.